Hi everyone, I'm Jonathan, co-founder and CEO of Stitch, and what we do is help sites engage and retain their clinical trial participants from screening all the way through to the end of the study. And welcome everyone to our webinar today. This is the second in our series of webinars that we're running to support sites in how they engage trial participants, and I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Campbell, COO of Invenio. So thank you, Mark, and welcome. Mark has spent over 25 years in clinical research and has a deep understanding of what operational excellence for research sites really looks like, and importantly, how to achieve it. And today, Mark is going to share some of his insights and stories from running global site businesses and outline the challenges he sees in the research market today. So we'll cover questions like, are we asking too much of our participants? What's the true financial impact of no-shows? And what is Mark doing right now to improve patient engagement at his sites? So thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you, Mark. It's going to be a great conversation. And please feel free to share thoughts and questions as we go. And with that, Mark, maybe I can start with asking you to share a little bit about your background, what you're doing now, and how you got started in the site world.
Yeah, no problems. Well, firstly, thank you for inviting me to speak today. So yeah, as you mentioned, I've been here in research for somehow 25 years, which is the entirety of my career. I started out very young in Johnson & Johnson, working through back then the move from paper to EDC in a more technical role. But over time, transitioned into a consultancy with a strong background in trial delivery, in terms of service delivery in a service organization. So my first blood for the site business was working in a European site network called Synexus Research, where I learned a significant amount about what it takes to run sites, engage sites, the challenges that different sites, countries face in terms of accessing research, and the drivers for patients to choose research as a way forward to treat some of the illnesses that they face. My current role is, as you mentioned, is Chief Operating Officer here at Invenio Research. We're a unique organization because we focus really on how to help sponsors reach patients, whether that's in the home, in their communities, or their medical facilities. And our real raison d'etre is driving representation in research. So that means we have to think a lot more about how we approach research. And I often say the art to recruiting patients is to lead with empathy and understanding. And if you can stand in the patient's shoes long enough to figure out why they choose to or not to engage in research, you're on to a good start.
And that's really interesting, because how does that lead with empathy link to some of the challenges that you're seeing in that site world? And can you just share a little bit about that, why you go down that route?
Yeah, sure. So, I think we start by saying that as much as we talk about research being a care option, really patients don't choose to get involved in research because we don't choose to get sick. We typically pursue them as a method to extending our life, our health span, our quality of life. So when you start at that point, really from a site perspective, you are the bridge between the drug developer who writes the protocols, determines the barriers, and interprets that at a patient level. So I think, firstly for us, when we lead with empathy, is we start with, if I was sick today, what would prevent me and what would influence me to join a research study? And, we have to consider across the world different levels of social economic drivers or barriers. We have to think about different levels of health literacy and understanding, or access to detailed enough understanding to build confidence. So in order to build confidence in patients, which is the role of the sites or recruiters, we have to understand where they start from. And often that could be a place of worry, uncertainty, and in some communities, maybe an element of lack of trust.
Interesting. And then, so that's really important from the patient's perspective, and actually getting into that mindset. And then zooming a little bit out to the site sort of industry and what's going on there. What are some of the challenges or sort of issues that you're seeing in the site industry today. Can you just talk us through some of those?
Yeah, so I think there's been a number of changes, particularly post-COVID. So, the site-based industry, if you take a short history of research, 20 years ago, it was largely academic centers, large research centers, which then evolved into more dedicated research sites. And you see a number of professional research site networks out there. Over the course of the last decade, we've seen a consolidation of site networks being absorbed by the CROs as they seek to build more certainty in their own prioritization of patient recruitment by owning their own site network. But also post-COVID, what we've seen is, a slowdown in drug research, reprioritizing of pipelines. We've certainly seen a slowing down of investment in biotech. For those site networks, they've seen headwinds of delays in studies, slowdown in studies. But they're also seeing increased price pressure from the drug developers as they seek efficiencies. So that in turn means, as a site network, as a community of sites, all of us, we have to think much more deeply about how we become more efficient. And efficiency for me is, how do we attract patients in a good, confident way into trials? If you look at site ID, there's been a tremendous change with AI. Artificial intelligence is coming into pharma. We're seeing a rise in prevalence of its application. Most recently, having discussions with a number of CROs as they tell me how they're using AI to select sites. And that's obviously a challenge if you're a new site network, if you have just opened a new site.
Yeah.
So site ID is certainly an area. So sites need to be productive, and they need to really lead from overcoming the challenges that are passed down to them down to the coalface.
And that's quite interesting, because I wonder if you can just talk through. So there was sort of summarized the importance of being from the participant's perspective, but then also some of the changes that are occurring at the site model, right? Especially with the post-COVID shift, as you're saying, and then the use of more data to select sites. But how does that actually sort of impact the site's business model? Is that core business model shifting that you're seeing? I'm just curious how you're seeing that manifest in actually the day-to-day running of a site business.
I think less so the day-to-day, Jonathan. From speaking with other site networks of various sizes, we've seen a change in terms of how sites selected, rather than being selected at a group level, at a enterprise level. Data is driving CROs to fragment site networks. So rather than winning a 12-site contribution, you may win a 6-site. So there's lots of pressures around the fragmentation of site selection, which is driving the site networks to make sure that they're able to perform at an individual site level. So that's a key one. In terms of inside the site networks, it's very much about how do we build engagement with the community? How do we get more people aware of our brand, build brand trust, brand recognition? And as we look to engage participants to consider research, a lot of the efficiencies and focus needs to be, how do we make it easier for patients? And how do we provide the step towards enrolling on a study, a journey? And for me, personally, is we need to consider the repercussions of catapulting a consumer from the armchair into the research chair. And I think that process needs to be more carefully curated, because for me, I've always said, the baseline is that a patient needs to meet the inclusion criteria of the study. But equally important is that they need to be a good candidate for research and understand their obligations and their contributions. And that's a key part of retaining patients in trial.
So that's interesting there. You're talking about the almost two sides of the participant's journey, and into research? One is, because we just think oftentimes we're just thinking about, is this person going to fit the study, but not just the study sort of fits the person. So could you just talk me through that like, I suppose, that journey, that funnel from a participant's perspective, sort of getting into research, and then maybe we can dig into some of the friction points that you see there, and sort of go deeper into them, some of the solutions. But just what's that sort of end-to-end journey?
Yeah, so I think number one, as I would say, there's no one patient is the same as the other. So the people's journey into research is truly individual. It's often not just it's not a individual decision. We rely on our siblings, our children, or our parents to guide us in our decisioning. So as we look to engage patients, we've got to not think about them as an isolated unit. And how do we give them information that they can understand? What is research? Why would you participate? What does it take to participate into the trial? What's the risk reward? And how can we provide it in bite-size, incremental points that they are able to articulate to loved ones, people who may influence them to or not to engage in research as an option. And these can be points prior to even getting the patient in front of us. Of course, once your patient's out into your medical community, you can build a longer term relationship for them. But the first step is, how do you get them to the front door so you can have a meaningful conversation? And that meaningful conversation is understanding what they face. You know, how many do they work on an hourly job? You know, how important is their job? How flexible is their job? Particularly as protocols aren't that flexible. Pharma's trying hard to innovate by pushing research into the home, making virtual research more accessible. But the lion's share of protocols are quite demanding on patients. So, but maybe that's daily diaries, weekly samples, monthly trips to the clinic. So part of retaining patients is to understand the underlying pressures about what they may face coming in. And that's important early in the engagement around people make tough decisions. And I always say this, we should never underestimate how difficult a life people live. They make tough decisions between putting gas in their car, feeding their children, heating their home, paying their rent. And when they're facing these challenges, and then we ask them to take time out in the day to engage in research, are we adequately compensating them for that? And secondly, are we asking too much of them during the enrollment? So these are things that researchers are like working through as they look at candidates for research. Is, you know, can you do what's needed for the trial, and how can we support you to remove those barriers?
And then when you're thinking about that point there, so there's a really interesting point there about setting the expectations, making sure people understand what's involved. How and you're talking about, you know, whether we expect too much from people at those points, so making it as easy as possible. What are some of the things that you feel might have the biggest impact at that moment when someone's making those decisions?
I think early on, so maybe pre-trial discussion, is often it's not particularly complicated ideas. It's things like, where do I go? Who will I meet? What can I expect when I'm there? Is there a friendly face to a friendly name that I connect also to a voice? How easy is it for me to recall or access simple information such as on the day of my appointment? And if it's my first appointment, just reassure me that I know where I'm going. Maybe I don't have a car, maybe transportation was available and some protocols allow for that. Do we provide bus routes? Do we provide different methods that they can choose to get to the site? And these are early indicators that there's a credible site at the end of the process for you. Someone, you know, a company who takes care in informing a patient, this is how you come and see us. Mary will meet you.
Yeah.
John will treat you, we'll do some bloods. If you have a problem, call this number. So we need to balance, we need a combination of technological support for sites that enable a human interaction. I think they're the critical points to get patients to the front door, which is the biggest hurdle, which is if you've not been in research before and you wake up on that morning, let's not underestimate the anxiety in my face. Maybe you don't want to sit there for work. Maybe you're easy about going in, and you look at methods or data that help you. This is a trustworthy, credible approach that we can take, particularly in communities that have a historical mistrust of research because of unethical practices or like local customs around the world. So these are the early steps that we need to take to build reassurance and build confidence with the patients, and that's what we look for. We ask patients, for commitment, and our job is to build that commitment by building confidence and trust, and that's really built in the first interactions that you have with the patient.
Okay, that's really interesting. So it's really important to build that trust early, and it's really important to set the expectations. And you're talking about here, we're talking about screening, almost like the start of the process, the screening visit piece. So what, just understanding that investment, and what is the impact on what is an impact on a site or site network if you're not making that that sort of investment? What happens if those sort of screening, people aren't showing up? Like, what, can you just talk me through the sort of the impact and the economics of it?
Yeah, in terms of if we think about the faster we try and move patients through the funnel, and we use that as a crude term in terms of patients through perhaps clicking on an ad, booking an appointment, having a phone call, arriving at the site, the faster and clunkier that process doesn't allow you to build adequate rapport and trust. So economically, what really matters is that sites are ultimately capacity driven. So a missed appointment, like any healthcare system, is time lost. It's resources spent that lay idle due to the fact that the patients made a choice not to come in. And the other side is that you might have spent time nurturing a external advertising campaign. So you're spending money to find patients. So really what matters is, as we look at optimizing the early parts of recruitment, is how do we get the best value for our investment, because we need to work in the community and talk to patients. We need to nurture our database. We need to find new patients to grow our presence within the community. So when it boils down to getting patients in to talk about research, and particularly at a trial level, which may be a consenting visit, it could be a consent screen and ran, depending if it's a vaccine study or more, complex chronic ambulatory disease. But ultimately, as sites fight for efficiency under pressure within the marketplace, they need to increase the utilization of their clinics. And by one really powerful way to do that is ensuring that you're able to reach new patients, build a path for them to your clinic, and secure them coming in. And economically, getting a patient into screening enhances the chance that they may choose to or be eligible for the trial. And then, of course, you lock long-term revenue in by doing so. So really, if you lead with empathy and follow the patient, in my mind, capacity grows, utilization grows, and revenue follows. I never believe that revenue is the driver for how we go around our business. What we do is we lean in on the patient to advocate for their needs, and the revenue often follows. But of course, for many site networks out there who are somewhat cash strapped, it's an important message for them it's an important message for them to focus heavily on guiding patients through the early stage of their journey towards enrolling on a study, and not focus too much about how do I enroll you on a study, but think about the journey there.
Yes, I suppose, like, when you look at that, right, there's an element that you have to find participants and get them into some sort of funnel. You talked about advertising campaigns. You might have your own database. You might have other sort of methods to try and attract participants in, but you've got to keep them engaged through that process so they actually turn up at your front door, I suppose, because otherwise that investment that you're making up front might not translate into a successful trial journey for that particular participant. But you also have to make sure you have the right person, or that you're offering your trial is the right fit for that person and where they are in their life and their situation.
Yeah, and there's no perfect science to it, but investing in a methodology that you can test and adjust over time, the more methodical you are on the back of a human touch, is the way to better measure whether or not you're doing the right thing. And obviously the voice of the patient along the way. Where we as an industry don't have standards is often tracking like how patients feel. We're interested how they feel about a protocol. We're interested about how they feel about being on a study. I don't think we have a lot of data out there about tracking truly tracking data about why they chose to engage in the concept of research, but ultimately chose not to attend the clinic. We can speculate using well-known barriers to research that are well documented. But I think as a site, we've got to understand our patients and our communities and why they may or may not choose to engage. We can continually invest in raising awareness or addressing some unknown barriers.
But why is that? That's a really interesting question. So why is it that at that point of the funnel, that point of, say, that screening visit, that first visit, that getting them into the door, as you say, at that beginning, why is that where the screening rate, the no-show rate is the highest? Like, what's going on there that's meaning that this is where the biggest sort of friction point is for those participants?
Yeah, I think it's simple when you put it in the eyes of the patient, which is that might be their first volley into research. So and you look at some of the conversations I've had with patients, which is as I mentioned, some people are making tough decisions, which is you're sick, there's research available to extend the quality of your life or your life. And that's sometimes a medium to a longer term view. But the morning of research, maybe their car isn't working, maybe their kids need help, maybe their financial situation has changed in the coming few days. So there's lots of things out there that are pressuring the patient, which we have to bear in mind. Some people are making quite short-term decisions in their lives because of their overall situation. When it comes to how might you overcome that, it's simple things like reminding them that their travel is going to be reimbursed, that they will have a stipend at the end of today. Of course, industry can do much better in reimbursing patients more reflective of the current economic situation, inflation rates, cost of living. So what we're keen on doing is just reminding patients of why, what's available to them, whether that's a travel support, stipend, particularly if economics are a barrier to research.
Okay, so that's interesting. So there's some of the things that you're trying to sell. So it sounds like it's strong communication, it's clarity. Are these some of like the initiatives? Like how if you're speaking to a sort of a fellow site network or a site that's in a similar situation, how would you actually go about doing that? What are the sort of initiatives that you would suggest people do?
Yeah.
Right.
So I think firstly, I always start with the sites need to lobby hard for their patients to get the maximum amount of support they can. Without patients, we don't have research, and more of the R&D dollars available to develop drugs need to filter down to the sites, and that's well documented. And there's many advocates out there on LinkedIn and the internet who are lobbying hard to make research less burdensome and more rewarding for patients, particularly those who may land with a placebo. So you get of course, the burden, but you don't get the benefit. So I think number one for the sites is that they need to lobby hard to get adequate funding to engage their communities, to grow their databases, and to support their patients who make what I deem as a brave choice to engage in investigational drug development for themselves, and ultimately, if the drug works, for better for society. I think that's deservingly of better funding. As you go past that, in terms of what can the sites do practically, I think they need to step back holistically, as we are, and think, what does our community need? Like, understand the people that you're engaging. Each community has different needs, different social economic challenges, different health literacy, food access. There's lots of social determinants of health that vary across our sites. We need to know, to a broad degree, what are the challenges that our patients face. And then when it comes to engaging, we need a holistic door-to-door, as I would call, from the patients to the clinic, is how do we build a communication strategy with them? How do we engage them in a conversation that's not just click on the ad, book an appointment, and show up? We've got to go much further than that. So really, it's about building a communication strategy of different modes and mediums. Some people have smartphones, some don't. So is a text message a nice little reminder in between conversations to keep them engaged? Maybe it's a website one-pager that tells us where to go and what to expect, and some friendly faces that they're going to meet. Or perhaps an email summarizing a visual of where to go and what to look at. So knowing that different patients don't always have access to the same level of technology or engage with technology the same way, we need to help facilitate their data collection and knowledge collection over different formats that's available to them. So if we take both lobbying for patients up front to make research far more appealing, and then get a communication strategy in place that incrementally builds understanding, and avoid the tendency to catapult patients from armchair to research chair. We've got to do more to build our trust and our engagement. So communication is a key one, and using different mediums to do that, both human interaction as well as digital interaction.
So it's about that connectivity, if you will, between the site and the participant throughout that entire sort of pre-study funnel. How does that then, do you then look to maintain? So we've talked a little bit here about sort of that screening journey and getting people close in and that connectivity there. Is that something then you look to maintain over the course of the entire study as well? Or is that sort of...
Yeah.
So tell me a bit about that, how that sort of...
Yeah. So, as you enter screening, as I mentioned, our physicians and clinical practitioners who are enrolling patients on the trial, we're trying to allowable degree understand the patient, through conversation and building rapport. But, we all know that research organizations are responsible for, at the end of the day, providing complete and compliant data sets to sponsors to maintain the scientific and statistical relevance for the trial. So particularly in long-term outcome studies, early leavers are bad for the statistical powering of studies. So with that in mind, we need patients to understand that their is an obligation or commitment, more to return within the window. And part of that is just a constant reminder of what's coming up, what to expect, how to get to the clinic. Perhaps a reminder that travel booking is a service available to them. So yeah, I think it's important that we always, from a planning perspective in Vineos, we start at the end game and work backwards, which is we need to collect data. We need to collect it in a reliable and repeatable way. That means we need to support patients to come into clinics, and to get patients into clinic for follow-ups, we need to understand how we might recruit them. We need to connect recruitment and retention more as an industry level. And we see retention often as a reactive mode. Research organizations, drug developers, protocol writers have done a lot over the last decade to improve the advanced thinking of how do we engage with patients, how do we lessen the burden, so that where patients are struggling perhaps with side effects or up titration or just weary, that we're able to build into the protocol a break. But ultimately, we focus heavily on when our patients coming in and what's our strategy in the interim to keep in touch, to keep that human touch around, whether it's a meet and greet or a courtesy call or a courtesy message, because sometimes there can be a lengthy break in between the visits.
So Mark, we've talked about no-shows in screening, but how do you go about quantifying the business impact of this? Like, what are some of the ways people can think about it?
Yeah, sure. So even we think at the simplest level of perhaps you're missing 2 visits a day over the course of the year, that's nearly 500 visits. Taking a number of different perspectives in terms of lost utility of your clinic, wages paid, lost revenue, both in the immediate and throughout the year, that can easily climb to around $2,000 per missed visit. So conservatively, if we take a clinic with good capacity and a good patient flow, just small increments of how do we secure 2 more patients per day can quite easily climb north of $1 million. So yeah, so the way I look at it is to improve the financial viability and economics of sites out there, particularly smaller site networks who are battling to win studies, is you can actually make incremental changes and improvements in your in the financial well-being of your site by making small gains each day in terms of making sure patients come back for their follow-up visits or attend a screening visit. And of course, the least time you've had with that patient, you'd see a larger no-show with patients who are being catapulted into research versus those who have been maybe in your database for time. So you can really put strategies in place that improve the touch points. And the more touch points you can have with a patient prior to their first in human or commitment into research is going to increase the patient's confidence. And we've seen that and heard that over a number of years for myself working across a number of networks. So financially, yes, if you can make small gains of, if you're a high volume site and you're losing 1 or 2 or 3 no-shows a day, those appointments, which unless you're double or triple booking slots, which has its own pitfalls to the patient experience, really what you're missing out on is immediate and long-term revenue. Those small changes can also make your site more productive. And as I said, with the AI selection and site ID, you can make small changes to your strategy by thinking through the patient experience from door to door. That's going to materialize in more randomizations and longer term revenue at a study level, but it's going to drive repeat business and being a site of choice for your customers.
So so thank you for that. It's really useful to understand how you think about it. Like you go from that funnel and the trust into actually this is a moment of really high leverage, and the area high leverage not just from a participant perspective, but also from an entire business model perspective. So and that's where sort of investing in that communication is probably the like one of the biggest highest leverage points. Cool, brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Mark. If I were to summarize our discussion, I think the last point that you made, I think, is probably one of the most important. Making small gains each day can have a huge impact on the P&L. If you have missed visits, you miss out on that immediate and the long-term revenue. So you've got to make sure people show up and also show up ready. And your suggestions around trust and taking care of the patient in their first interactions, connectivity through multi-channel sort of communication and keeping everybody engaged, and then making sure that you're really thinking through that patient journey. So thank you so much. It's so much, Mark. It's been fantastic to hear more about your approach to patient engagement. And for everyone joining us today, I hope you've taken away some actions that you can take right now for your sites. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or Mark to learn more.
I really appreciate it, Jonathan. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Mark.